Okay, we're going to start the session now. And hello, everyone. I would like to remind the participants that out of respect for a speaker, please remain muted during this session. And also make sure to keep your video on and feel free to ask any questions in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Gonzalo Mateos. Dr. Mateos is an accomplished scholar in the field of electrical engineering with a rich academic background and extensive contributions to research. Currently, he holds the position of Associate Professor at the University of Rochester, where he also serves as the Associate Director for Research at the University of Rochester's Goergen Institute for Data Science. Throughout his academic career, Dr. Mateos has demonstrated his expertise in statistical learning from complex data, network science, decentralized optimization, and graph signal processing. His research extends to diverse applications such as brain connectivity, dynamic network health monitoring, social networks, power grid systems, and big data analytics. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
Well, thank you very much. My great pleasure being here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for all who are attending or eventually listen to this as a recorded session. Let me share my screen and let this presentation go. I hope everybody can see the slides. And with this, I can move. Okay, so my goal for today, it's basically to provide a high-level overview of a breadth of opportunities and applications that can benefit from machine learning on graphs, as the workshop lecture title suggests. We're going to be talking about learning with graphs, and we're going to get into exactly what that means in a second. As for today's presentation, I'll focus mostly on the why I'm gonna motivate this field, and also the what, showing some success stories in terms of what can be done and why this is interesting, but not so much on the how. I don't have enough time to go into technical details of how these machine learning models actually work, but at the end, I'll give you some pointers if you wanna learn more about that. Okay, so then that's a little bit the plan for today. So let's start by the very beginning, right? And then one would like to understand what are networks, what are graphs, which are, again, typically mathematical representations of these network systems. And then what I would do first is maybe, okay, go to the dictionary. If I search for the definition of a network, then what I find is a collection of interconnected things, right? So, okay, there's first thing to notice, there's multiple things, and then both of them are important. But again, most importantly of all is that they are connected, kind of. The relations are what matter here. Now, there's two extremes of two related notions that sometimes we maybe use interchangeably, but I want to make this distinction clear because it's important. Then on the one hand, we have sort of a real, often complex system of interconnected components. That's what we want to study. And then here's an example on the left where it's basically a characterization of the cellular level biomolecular processes behind what's known as the circadian rhythm of a very simple organism, in this case, the fruit fly. This circadian rhythm is a 24-hour periodic process that most organisms have that allows us to adapt to light day and night, and that's why in terms of how we process light, and that's why we want to go to sleep at night and we're awake during the day. But anyways, what we see, we can view this as a complex system. We like to see what's going on to explain that phenomena. And okay, going to the definition, we can see there's various components here, right? These rectangles correspond to proteins. And then this, as we stack them vertically, as we see over here, then this is suggesting that then these proteins are physically binding. So there's interconnections among them. Hence, we have components, and then we have their relations, right? But also there's more to that in this particular system over here. There's the circles, which corresponds to genes, and then there's proteins genes that code for some proteins, and then these relationships basically among genes now is what we call regulatory interactions, kind of to what extent a protein is controlling the expression level of a gene, how much of a protein that's been coded in a gene is being produced. But in a way, the details do not matter here. I just want to mention that in this example, for instance, we get to see elements, proteins in this case, and the potential relationships could be their physical binding or their affinity to bind to build more complex organisms, but also we could have genes and their regulatory interactions. That's another form of a relation, right? And we have all of this in a gate together through some connection patterns, then give rise to this particular system. And again, that's what we call the network, which already kind of looks like a graph in this particular case, but you can think of a financial system at the global level. You can think of the brain and the like. So then that's the object of interest, the network in this case. And then on the other hand, we have a graph, which is, again, a very simple toy picture over here, but then this could be a representation of this system over here, okay? And then what's a graph? Basically, it's a collection of nodes or vertices, the dots over here, which typically represent the elements, for example, the proteins or the genes, depending on what we wanna reflect. And then edges, a set of edges, the line over here, which represent the relationships among these objects of interest, right? So then there's two aspects to this. One has the network, the complex system of interest, and then we have the mathematical representation of it through a graph, okay, which is just a collection of nodes, vertices, and edges connecting them. And then we often use this language, the language of graph theory, to represent the system of interest, okay? So then what's the key premise here is, well, if we want to understand these complex systems, especially when they have multiple components, and then what we care about are their relationships, well, a good approach could be to understand the underlying circuitry behind them by looking at their graph representations. And that's a little bit what we're going to be pursuing today, and then using data, how can we learn from these particular systems, okay? But that's the notion of a network, and then a graph representation of it. So let me just give you some historical background, because network-based analysis in the sciences has actually a very long history. One can go back to the mathematical foundations of a graph theory that arguably can be attributed to Leonhard Euler back in the 1735. For instance, in the 18th century, here's a very famous problem, the problem of the 7 bridges of Königsberg. Euler at the time, what he was thinking is, okay, you have the city of Königsberg, there's the river Pregel, and then there's a couple of island here, and then famously there's 7 bridges connecting the different land masses. And then what Euler was thinking at the time was, okay, is there a walk around the city one can devise, which will allow you to go everywhere, basically crossing each bridge once and only once? Can you find such sequence in a way, okay? That's what he was thinking at the time. And then the interesting phenomena here is what was his abstraction to solve the problem that's arguably laid the foundations of graph theory. What he recognized, right, as you can abstract this at this, and in a way, what matters here to answer the question is how much you walk inside the land masses or the island doesn't matter, right? The only thing that matters is the sequence of bridges you take in your walk, and asking yourself whether you have to repeat the bridge to basically go everywhere. So then, in a way, how much you move here doesn't matter. So then the land masses can basically be abstracted as these dots over here, and then the important information are the bridges, which we represent as edges in this graph. And then you start to walk over this graph, and the question is, can you devise a walk that traverses each edge, in this case, each bridge, once and only once, okay? So then this abstraction led to maybe arguably the first notion of a graph. Then this, of course, evolved in many other areas within the sciences and engineering. We know the laws of electrical circuitry by Kirchhoff, voltage laws or current laws, then molecular structure in chemistry due to Cayley. Now network representations of social interactions, namely social network analysis that is attributed to Jacob Moreno back in the 1930s, where he was studying small groups of students within a classroom and their relationships, and he was building what he called sociomatrices or sociographs to encode relationships among different students. Then, of course, we have a man-made infrastructure networks, power grids, telecommunications, the internet, and then Google, Facebook, Twitter, online social networks, and basically the rest is history, as we know. Now, again, the premise, we want to understand complex systems that arise in various domains. One approach based on network science is to try to look at the underlying circuitry, look at the graphs, the networks behind them, right? So then this has been a relatively small field of study up until the mid-90s, but then there was an epidemic-like of explosion more recently, and I would say there's a few reasons for that. One fundamental is that there was a change in the paradigm in how we perform science right now. If you go back to the 20th century, everything was dealing with reductionism, basically going at the very fundamental particles, the atoms, and then how that gives rise to different matter and the like. But now we've switched gears and then take more of a systems level perspective to science, where we look at different components and then how they interact to give rise to more interesting macro level phenomena, right? So then from reductionism to systems level, and of course the systems level approach is very well aligned with a network based approach to studies of complex systems. Of course, like in machine learning, AI, the fact that we can collect data in very high throughput with very high quality in genomics, if you want, and computational power, of course, all of that has fueled progress in this field. Fundamentally as well, globalization, right? The internet, the fascination or a kind of, in terms of understanding the connectedness of modern societies, all of those questions and kind of the push to try to understand what's going on as to why distances have been shrinking at all levels, why we are so connected, then has only fueled this trend. And then, of course, there's interesting aspects in terms of that has driven scholars to try to study these type of problems. The fact that data are becoming more, when you collect graphs, they're more complex, there's heterogeneity, there's interesting statistical dependencies among the components, there's dynamisms because these networks can change across time. All of them have made this a very interesting kind of field that has received a lot of attention, growing attention over the last 20, 30 years, okay? The impact is, at the end of the day, what matters the most, and that's what I'm going to be focusing over the next several minutes. Many applications going all the way from drug design, smart infrastructure, smart cities, smart transportation, collaborative intelligence or autonomy, climate systems, all of them in a way have a nice connection when viewed through the lens of networks, graphs, and network science. If I start, for instance, economic impact, I don't have to tell you much, but if you look again, all of these technologies driven by the web, the internet, online social media, there's huge companies with, again, very large economic impact. I have to change these numbers every time I give this talk because they're changing and growing all the time. If you think about healthcare, of course, that's, again, fundamental. Networks have to play a role. If you look at, for instance, prediction of epidemics, I have an example here on the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, but I could have shown the same thing, and this has evolved a lot if we think about COVID. Whenever we want to do a prediction, right, of epidemic processes, those models are often parameterized by networks, by contact networks, mobility networks, right? Those are fundamental, just to see how people are moving around from one place to the other, potentially carrying the pathogen, right, or the virus from one place to the other one. So then parameterizing these models, not only with the dynamics of how the virus spreads, but actually using networks that in a way model, right, the interactions or mobility of potential agents, right, across a geographical area or at a global scale. That's, of course, fundamental. And here, just one example of what this is. Then this map is showing the number of cases, the real number of cases across the different parts of the US. And here's, again, the predicted values, which look very similar using a network-driven model of epidemic prediction. kind of just showing that this can be done really well. And there's been huge progress in epidemic modeling, of course, moving from a classical homogeneous mixing to a more structured population model, which takes into account these so-termed contact networks, right? And again, clearly, networks or connectivity is fundamental to the spread of an epidemic or a virus or viral content if you go beyond pathogens, right? And that's why they tell us to quarantine, to stay at home, trying to sever those ties in those networks so that then the virus cannot spread, okay? So then networks which are more connected will make it spread more, and then we try to sever ties through quarantine or other measurements. Reducing mobility is key. That means if you want to view it this way, reduce the connectivity or the density of connectivity between a contact network. Another domain of interest, of course, is that of network neuroscience. I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but there's been, again, huge interest and huge investments in the US and worldwide as well in terms of trying to using recent advances, right, in neuroimaging data, neuroimaging technologies to try to map out brain circuitry and then come up from neuroimaging data, MRI, functional diffusion, and other technologies. How can one use signal processing pipelines to construct these very beautiful sort of pictures that show at a very detailed level the different fiber tracts in the brain, and then understanding how the brain is connected, where's density of connections, where there's less. This can be mapped to a network graph in the field of network neuroscience, and more of that in a second. Now, also homeland security impact. One success story in the field of intelligence was in the capturing of Saddam Hussein back in the day when the Iraqi regime actually fell. Intelligence officers were actually going after government or military officials from the Iraqi regime without any luck in terms of capturing Saddam. What they realized eventually that was more key was trying to trace out the closer connections at the family level or tribal level that led to this social network mapping of the connections to Saddam. Eventually, I believe they got to one of his closest cousins, who was his bodyguard, and eventually led to his capture back in the day. But again, using social network analysis, they were able to map out his connections and eventually found him. I would say we are also witnesses, and this is actually very, very important and very exciting, I believe, tremendous impact in what's scientific discovery, right? Here's a breakthrough in the problem of what's known as protein folding. You may have heard of this in the news a few years ago. Proteins are very large complex molecules, which are made of chains of amino acids, like a sequence. And what a protein does, actually, its function, largely depends on its unique 3D structure. So then proteins basically fold into these very nice, fancy 3D structures, very complex, as you think, but then the function of the protein very much correlates with this 3D folding of it, right? Now, figuring out if you are given the one-dimensional sequence of a protein, right? Figuring out how the protein folds, well, that's known as the protein folding problem, and it has stood as a fundamental grand challenge in biology over the last 50 years. That problem is very, very hard because given a 1D sequence of amino acids, the number of possible foldings is basically astronomical, 10 to the 300. That's a number that's basically impossible to even conceptualize. So it's a very hard problem that has been very hard to solve, and potentially, I don't know, it was thought of that we're never going to be able to solve this in our lifetimes. Well, as you may have heard, there's been an AI-based system developed using deep learning by Google's DeepMind, that's known as AlphaFold, where they using, again, leveraging the power of data and deep learning to obtain representations, distance-based, that's where the graphs enter the picture here, of these proteins. They were able to explore the search space and then manage to actually admittedly solve the problem based on these computational advances using AI. And here you can see some examples, right? Using experiments, that's how you figure out imaging technologies, you figure out the structure of the proteins. And then you can see here in dark blue or purple, the computational predictions using a AlphaFold system. They're basically perfect. And then they can use this technique, and they have been able to show remarkable results across a host of proteins. And then this problem that maybe several years ago was believed to be unsolvable, a major challenge in biology, now is effectively solved. And then that's, again, a huge breakthrough in what the impact this can have, then in understanding proteins and then how organisms work. Then this is basically fundamental. Now, in summary, having given you that introduction, right, I hope I've convinced you that graphs are very natural models of relational data that we encounter in a host of domains, and then using graphs can help us learn effectively and scalably in various timely applications, all the way from economic networks, social networks, of course, the internet, maybe the network of networks, transportation systems, as I mentioned, brain connectomes. Again, don't forget molecules are themselves graphs whose nodes are the atoms, and then the edges are the bonds connecting those atoms. Then you can have these more timely, fancy graphs given the complex data we're collecting. These are known as knowledge graphs, which can have very different relationships among different entities. But again, graphs are arising everywhere. We have access to the data. And then the question is, what are tasks or problems we can think of where machine learning can help us in this particular domain? So here's just a summary, a taxonomy. And again, these tasks in a way often relate to different aspects of a graph. One can have node level tasks, prediction, edge level predictions, maybe at the subgraph level, looking at a submodule within a graph, or graph level predictions, maybe to classify different graphs. And then if you go over this list over here, you can think of problems all the way from just graph visualization and then pattern discovery, especially in very large complex graphs. Then just visualize them is a non-trivial task per se. If you think about generative AI as it pertains to graph, huge interest in what's graph modeling and generation. For example, can I generate new molecules which have antibacterial properties, right? Maybe I train a model with graphs that I know have that property, then the model can spit out new molecules and maybe can discover new antibiotics, for instance, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Classical problem, I'm going to show an example later, is that of unsupervised clustering of nodes in a graph, how to identify communities, modules which are highly connected, maybe cohesive groups within a social network, individuals which have same political beliefs, or individuals which have the same, I don't know, interests, or they like the same products, and then I can target them a marketing campaign, for example. Big class of problems today are those known as node classification. How do I classify different vertices? We're going to see that in a second through an example of a protein function classification. Another widely studied problem, a lot of which I've worked in my own research, has to do with link relation prediction. For instance, if I want to predict, I know there's an edge here, maybe I don't know what's going on here, if there's an edge on an edge, and then this could be relevant if you think about networks where nodes could be users, and then you have another group of nodes which could be movies or products, then, well, predicting links from observing some other links then could be thought of as a solution to a recommendation system problem, right? I want to see which nodes like which particular products, then I have to predict the relationship among those two entities, and then that's very relevant in recommendation systems for Amazon, for Netflix, and beyond. And of course, one can think of classifying or, again, assigning to different classes the whole graph, for example, to predict cognitive decline from different networks of the brain. So let's see some examples of these tasks. Here's the first one that has to do with predicting protein function. This is an example of a node classification task. Suppose we have this network over here. That's a Baker's yeast data, a very simple organism. The graph has 134 vertices or nodes, which are proteins, the dots over here, and 241 edges, which are protein interactions, physical interactions among those. So then that's the graph that's given to me. And then let's suppose that there's labels for each of the nodes. That's why I'm color coding them yellow or blue. In this case, this represents a functional notation for a particular function of this organism, namely intercellular signaling cascade, not very important, but has to do with signal transduction, how a cell reacts to the environment. So then each protein, each node could be annotated as being related to ICSC. That's yellow nodes. And then if they have nothing to do with ICSC, then we color code them blue. Okay, so then the problem here is, suppose I'm given the graph, and then I'm given some of these labels, but then I don't know all of them. And then if you notice, right, the colors are fairly constant or smooth within highly connected regions of the graph. So then there's some smoothness of the label space on the graph. So then the graph might be able to help me. Suppose I don't know this color over here. I want to predict the function of this protein, right? I want to say whether it's yellow or blue. Suppose I don't know the answer, but well, most of the neighbors of this node are actually yellow. So then if I do like a majority voting, of course, leveraging the graph, then that would suggest that this is yellow. And of course, using that simple idea of graph smoothing, many algorithms of machine learning on graphs are developed to predict labels on the nodes. That's exactly a node classification task. Now, another classical problem, often unsupervised, which I mentioned before, is that of clustering the nodes in a graph. That's usually known as network community detection, where the goal is to unveil basically latent modular structure within a network. Biological systems, here's this political blogosphere, where nodes are websites, blogs, and then links are connections among these blogs before the US 2004 presidential election. And then you can have the liberal blue nodes and the red conservative blogs, and then the modular structure is actually apparent. But the problem is, okay, what if all of these nodes are color-coded black? And then I shuffle around all these nodes, so then I don't see this apparent structure, which of course the visualization is actually showing us here. The question is, can I identify those blue and red groups, namely that set of two communities, which is clearly apparent in this particular network? Again, that's the problem of community detection. Now, another domain that, again, I work a lot in my own research group, that's a fertile ground, of course, for graph-centric analysis and learning, is neuroscience, okay, network neuroscience. And then arguably one of the greatest challenges of our time is to make progress towards trying to understand, right, brain function, actually the coupling between function and anatomical structure, very important. And then the studies of networks of the brain, as the ones we see over here, right? They call them connectomes, has gained major traction over the last couple of decades, given rise to this field of network neuroscience within just computational neuroscience. And then how do we obtain networks of the brain from neuroimaging data? Well, experts typically partition the brain or the cortex of the brain into different regions, into a brain atlas. Then from neuroimaging data, for example, diffusion MRI, one can use very fancy signal processing algorithms, tractography algorithms, to obtain those tractography maps of different fiber tracts at the brain. Now, if we register those tractography maps over the brain atlas, and then we let each of these regions, right, become a node on my brain graph, well, what they do is they actually measure how many fibers connect, let's say, one region to the other one, and then if the number of fibers or the edge density is above a threshold, they say, okay, I'm gonna connect those two regions, right? So then that way, regions of interest in a brain atlas become nodes, and then based on density of connections of fiber tracts between different regions, I can decide whether I'm gonna connect or not those different regions. So then, again, using neuroimaging data, we can construct networks of the brain, structural connectivity or functional connectivity, and with that, we can do various different things. When we feed those networks to machine learning on graph pipelines, for example, what are known as graph neural networks, right? And then here's some work we did with one of my students as an example of subject level classification, where have a population of individuals, some of them for which we can image them and construct their brain graphs. Some of them don't drink alcohol at all. Some others are heavy drinkers. And then the question is, can we classify? Is there something that's changing in the structure of their brain? And then we can extract from that graph structure maybe some differences. And indeed, one can successfully do that by processing these structural connectivity maps. Here's representations in 2D we obtain using a graph neural network of each of those networks. And then you can clearly see, right, that for non-drinkers and drinkers, this, of course, is a two-dimensional projection. So we can see that in the plane. Really, I don't know, these embeddings or representations can show us that there is a difference, right? This cluster, and you can, in a way, tell them apart, of course, not perfectly because data are highly noisy, but there is some structure that the graphs are revealing, right? And then we often go further ahead, and then we look at what connections were significantly weakened, right? What connections among regions in the brain were significantly weakened by heavy drinking, and those are the ones we're showing over here. These are regions of interest in these brain maps, and then all of these connections were significantly weakened, but we also found that there are some connections, interestingly, that were strengthened, and then one can hypothesize that there's some mechanism of neural compensation. So we lose some function, but then through compensation, we try to keep up, and then these are interesting things that could be happening. Yeah. Now, this is also another very cool application, the problem of authorship attribution, where graphs can play a role. So then what's the goal here? Well, we want to identify the author of a text of unknown precedence, right? And then why do graphs or networks show up here? Well, because they can be used, interestingly, as a proxy of the author's grammar, actually their style of writing, right? And then here you can see the so-termed word adjacency matrices that were constructed from the plays of William Shakespeare and his contemporary Christopher Marlowe, right? So then the idea is that you look at different words, those that carry no meaning, they're called function words, connectors. You can see some examples over here. And then we connect those words, edges in these ones, depending on how often pairs of words appear closed in their texts, right? So then in a way, these graphs represent sequences of words and then how close they are. So we can think of these networks as a proxy of the style of the different dramatists in this case. Well, very interestingly, these graphs and actually difference among these graphs, like the traces in their style, were sufficient to provide evidence that Henry VI was actually, as speculated for many years, was indeed a collaboration among the two dramatists. And I think in the New Oxford Shakespeare edition of 2016, now Henry VI is actually credited to both of them. And again, many other similar studies have been conducted beyond, but I think this is also a very nice application where graphs and then comparison of graphs using computational methods can be then brought to bear for interested applications. So what are the challenges when it comes to machine learning on graphs? I showed some nice applications, tasks, but then what does it take, or why is it interesting to look at problems and then develop new technologies to learn from such graph data? Well, I hope we can all agree, given the AI and deep learning revolution, we're pretty good at this point in learning from data in Euclidean domains, where the domain is very regular, right? For example, sequences like texts or speech using recurrent neural network or powerful architectures like transformers. Also, we can think of multidimensional grids, like two-dimensional grids or pixels. That's what you have when you look at an image, right? And you want to do object recognition or the like using convolutional neural networks. So then when the signal values are defined on very regular domains or very regular graphs, let's say in audio, when you have a time sequence, or in an image, you have a two-dimensional regular lattice, well, there's a lot of structure in the domain here, which we can leverage through known models and technologies to do effective learning. Now, all that's very nice, but in the context of today's talk, right, we want to learn from data defined on graphs that do not look like this, but they look as something like this, right, as an abstraction, a toy picture of something like a network like this one over here, right? So then there's a bunch of challenges in going from learning from data in structured domains to irregular structures like graphs, because there's no inherent geometry, right? In an image, you can say, this pixel is close to this one, hence both of them should be blue. or this one is close to this one from the wall, so both of them should be gray. But in a graph, right, there's no notion of distance. This node in general is not close to this one. What are two nodes in a social network? We don't have a notion of similarity, which we leverage strongly in convolutional neural networks, right? Neighborhoods are very regular. Here, all nodes have 4 neighbors, right? Here, all nodes have 2 neighbors. But in a general graph, well, that could be very regular. Highly connected nodes versus loosely connected nodes. So then that changes all the time. Of course, networks could be of arbitrary size. They're often dynamic. So then things that we take for granted, like, for example, how to do a convolution on an image, right? That's not clear because we don't know how to translate, for example, a signal value in a graph. There's many ways to go, right? Here it's only up, down, left, right. But in a graph, it can be many different ways. So then all of those things that we take for granted then have to be carefully reevaluate and then thought of in terms of how do we generalize those notions to then go from a CNN, for example, to a graph neural network, GNN, to learn on graphs. And then that has to do with the how, in a way, with the technical details. I'm not going to talk about that today, but there's, again, a lot of interesting things, a lot of vibrant developments in this field of machine learning on graphs. I just want to bring to your attention the concept of a graph neural network. That's clearly the main learning engine that people have been working on today to learn from graph data. And I'm going to give you at the end of the presentation some pointers to software tools and then some courses that actually delve into the details of how one can build those machine learning pipelines for various applications. Now, in what remains of my talk, I just want to give you several examples of deployments, successful deployments of machine learning on graph technologies in the wild. Really, in real-world applications, large-scale companies are looking at these technologies to satisfy their needs. And I just want to, in a way, through examples, through success stories, show you that these technologies are really impactful and they're really being deployed in today's technologies that we are using, again, at many aspects of lives, and oftentimes we take for granted. I just want to show that these technologies are really making a difference. And a first example here has to do with recommendation systems at Amazon. They're looking at what's known as complementary product recommendation. The problem they want to address is the following, right? As always, suppose you carry out an item purchase query. So you bought something or you're looking at something, then Amazon wants to know, right, which other related but also diverse items they would like to recommend to you. Like, for example, this example is from their paper. I just happen as well to like tennis. The question is, okay, suppose I buy a racket, right? Then, well, Amazon would like to suggest related things like a can of balls, but they want also them to be diverse, like not just one can of balls and then a pack of 6 can of balls. That's not too diverse, right? So then they would like to offer me a can of balls, maybe a headband, and a bag of rackets, right, which are really related, but also diverse, so that then I'm likely to buy all of them, hopefully for them. Now, where do graphs play a role here? And again, this is very rich data and very interesting that Amazon has. They actually have developed a graph representation learning module or a deep learning module based on this very unique behavior-based product graph that they have at hand. What are nodes in these behavior-based product graphs? Well, these are catalog items. And here's just a sample of 4 of them, but they have gazillion of products, right? Which are the catalog items with some textual features as well. This is an example of a node. And then edges in this BPG graph reflect historical browse and purchase behavior. For example, like you bought this and also bought that, or you view this and also view that, or you bought this after viewing that. So then they have this set of very rich relationships among products based on what people have historically been doing while browsing at Amazon. And based on that, you can build these networks where nodes are items and you have these relationships from which you can infer, right, using very fancy machine learning on graph architectures, what are related products which you want to recommend and the like, by obtaining representations of those and then give useful representation. So then again, a successful story, they have actually shown, deployed this on real recommendation systems in production used by Amazon, showing business gains significant as they detailed in this paper over here. Now, Another very interesting application has to do with the discovery of polypharmacy side effects. Again, as we get older, hopefully not quite yet, we start to, I don't know, use different drugs to take care of our different ailments. But then as we combine a lot of these drugs, right, what we call as polypharmacy, then there could be side effects to using many of those, right? Of course, many of these side effects, they're already revealed to us because these are known, but then many others, as we start to combine different drugs, we really don't know. And it would be nice to discover those, of course, to avoid potential problems, right? So then, well, what is the approach they have proposed over here? And then what's the rich graph data structure they have been leveraging using a very complex machine learning on graph GNN module? Well, there is here a multimodal graph which has proteins, the orange circles over here as one type of node, but there's a different type of nodes, which are the drugs, the triangles over here. So then that's why multimodal, right? One mode are the proteins, another mode are the drugs. And then we have interactions among each of them and across, right? For example, we have protein-protein interactions, as we saw early on in our circadian rhythm or our protein function prediction. So then proteins, of course, interact. They physically bind. Those are the connections over here. There are drug-protein interactions, right? Because drugs are developed or targeted to target specific proteins, right? So then that's those relationships we have as well. But we have, interestingly here, right, also drug-drug interactions, which actually model or represent side effects, right? When you use these two drugs together, then what are potential side effects you could have? And then here are some examples of R1, R2. R1 is gastrointestinal bleed side effects. R2 is bradycardia, and then you have all of those across different proteins, right? So then what is the problem here? Well, given this network where we know some of these relationships, but then some of them are not known, we would like to unveil polypharmacy side effects by predicting, right, drug-drug edge type. So for a pair of drugs for which I don't know what are the potential side effects, I want to target this as a link prediction problem to try to identify among a set of candidates potential side effects. Well, what is highly likely to occur among those? Maybe none of them, which is fine, no side effect, but then I want to discover that. So then, again, the message here is that this problem, given this rich data of protein interactions, drug interactions, and then drug-protein interactions, we can cast it as a multi-relational link prediction problem over a complex multimodal network, which can be solved using GNNs, as in this paper is shown, and you can look at it if you want to know more technical details. But just, again, what I want to convey here is the idea of, again, an interesting problem of great importance, which can be solved through the lens of machine learning on graphs. Another one is, okay, we every day most likely use Google Maps, and well, as it turns out, a graph neural network is running under the hood in today's deployment of Google Maps for the sake of actually predicting time of arrival. Okay, whenever we enter, this is the airport in Uruguay, my home country, I want to go to my university to work. Well, I just put that in Google Maps. Google Maps tells me, well, it takes you 33 minutes. Okay, well, those predictions carried out and updated recurrently from terabytes of anonymized traffic data and updated all the time, every 5 minutes and beyond, well, they are relying on a very powerful machine learning on graphs model using a GNN. The gist of the idea, again, a very simplified form, you can see more in their paper over here, is that they look at road networks. That's our graph, where you have roads as edges and then intersections as nodes. And then they partition road networks into what they call super segments, which are just adjacent roads that share a common traffic volume, right? So then from a large road network, they just build small subgraphs, which they call them super segments of different roads, which carry, again, common traffic, and then given data they collect of current drivers and how long it's taken to traverse these different paths, they can then learn representations or embeddings of these little graphs, and then they piece all of these together eventually to make a prediction of how to go from here to there. Again, I'm obviating all the technical details over here, but again, the message is that graph neural networks are key components in the engine that's running behind Google Maps to give us predictions of how long it's going to take us to go from point A to point B across the globe. Okay, so then prediction models for ETAs are relying on GNNs. And again, the moment they started using GNNs, they showed there were huge improvements in their accuracy of predictions, and that's why they are used in their systems today. Now, another example I alluded to before was that of antibiotic discovery when I talk about generative models to generate new graphs. In this paper over here, they've used GNN models to predict antibiotic activity, in particular E. coli resisting bacteria growth inhibition in different type of molecules. What's the idea and what has been the breakthrough here? Well, the idea is, again, remember, molecules are graphs, right? Where nodes are atoms and then edges are the bonds. And then what they did is they train a model over thousands of different molecules for which they have labels on whether they had antibiotic properties or not. Namely, if you are antibiotic, that means that you inhibit a lot the growth of this particular bacteria. If you don't inhibit at all, well, you are not a good antibiotic. So then some molecules are antibiotics, some are not. And then the idea is to train a model based on machine learning and graphs, a GNN that learns representations of nodes and edges, as described over here, to, again, predict antibiotic property. The idea is that this model, if well trained, then when I show it, when I feed it with a new molecule, then it's going to answer, oh, does this molecule have good antibiotic properties or not? Okay, and as you can see in the scale of the chemical landscape, right, models are trained with the order of 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4 thousands of molecules, right? Now, conventional approaches to antibiotic discovery, typically, they are limited, right, in how many molecules they can screen because the process is very expensive. You have to do experiments. It's time-consuming. So then you can just have a bounded exploration space, typically at most in the order of millions of molecules. And again, this takes a lot of time, and it's highly inefficient, right, because it's expensive, time-consuming, and then out of just, at most, millions of screen molecules, you can identify just maybe 1% of them which are candidate antibiotics. Now, if we use machine learning on graphs with a trained model, which is not too expensive to train, we can then now in silico, right, feed this model with the whole chemical landscape of potential molecules to screen them, right, in the order now of 10 to the 8. So we go from here to here. We can explore a lot more molecules that we couldn't do before. And then in this particular work, they have shown, for instance, a kind of a key finding is that the model was able to predict that this molecule, halicin, has really high antibiotic properties. It has very much strong antibacterial activity. And then something very interesting, right, is that actually halicin has a structure that's very different from known antibiotics, right? Then machine learning was able to identify not only a very powerful antibiotic, but also the antibiotic itself can have a very different structure than well-known molecules. So then kind of AI can teach us, or in a way, or discover new knowledge or different structures. And the same thing, like AI systems for playing chess or for playing Go or whatever, they can, again, discover very complex strategies that were not known by humans, right? So then this allows to expand our exploration, our knowledge to other strategies, structures, and fields. Finally, I just want to talk about 1 second about this other, engineering breakthrough that has to do with a problem now in chip design. They have targeted at Google the problem of what's known as chip floor planning for next generation circuit design. What's the problem of chip floor planning that has been kind of evading automation for decades? Well, it's the engineering task of designing the physical layout of a computer chip, right? So then you have multiple components, you have to place them in a chip, but that's not easy because there's a lot of constraints you want to adhere to, right? You want to optimize for performance, you want to minimize power consumption, minimize chip area, and then wire length to minimize crossings among wires. So then that optimization is a very hard combinatorial problem whose space is, again, astronomical, like the same, similar to what we had in the different ways that a protein could fall. So their approach over here is, of course, to recognize that a computer chip can be viewed as a graph, a netlist, as they call it, which is a hypergraph of modules, memory units, gates, and the like, connected by wires. The wires are the edges in this hypergraph. The components are the nodes. And then the question is, okay, well, their approach was to use a very fancy reinforcement learning model where they relied on machine learning on graphs to obtain simpler representations of these very complex structures and then guide the search to then reduce significantly the time to obtain optimized structures, cheap configurations or floor plans. And they have shown also impact in their paper, right? They claim to have used this new technology to design the latest, the TPU V5, which is kind of the latest next generation accelerator for machine learning implementations that Google has developed. Okay, so then they used these technologies to efficiently and quickly design the latest TPU, which is, again, TPU is Google's accelerator. Compare it with the GPU, which is what we also use as developed by NVIDIA and beyond. Okay, so that's all I have. Again, as I promised, in these slides, which are, again, you'll have it in the YouTube video, but I'll be happy to share these slides to, if you want them, just send me an email. There's pointers to several resources on GNN network analysis libraries and data sets, PyTorch Geometric, GRaph, DeepGraph Library, NetworkX. These are Python packages to do a lot of things to work with graphs and then develop models or GNNs to learn with graphs. And if you want to know more about the how, in a way, well, here's a list of some very nice GNN courses at UPenn from my collaborator Alejandro Ribeiro. He has a lot of nice videos and Google Colabs. Stanford University, Jure Leskove has also a very nice course offered every winter on learning with graphs, and the same at the University of Rochester, the class I'm teaching. All of them have all the material publicly available. Some of them have video recordings of all the lectures, a lot of pointers to network data sets, and resources like software. So then, and also lab assignments to get your hands dirty and then try these models out on real data to get into learning and then getting a feel of the power of these models. And again, this is just some pointers if you want to know more about what really is going on under the hood. I haven't talked at all about this in this particular lecture, which was more on the why, right? Why is this important? And then what, why, where it has been used and what's the impact, but not too much on really how things are operating here, right? So then that's all I have for today. Key message, hopefully that's been conveyed. Graphs are natural model for relational data that can help us learn in various timely applications. Leveraging structure and coding the graph is really fundamental for scalable, efficient learning with good generalization. And there's a host of, if you want to do research in this field, a lot of important opportunities, both on the fundamental methodological side, but also on application-specific side, issues of fairness, trustworthiness on ML on graphs. It's been really looked at today because using the graph structure in learning can amplify existing biases, issues of combinatorial optimization problem solvers, as I said, distributed collaborative intelligence, multi-agent systems of robots and the like. That's another fertile ground for application, neuroscience and beyond. So lots of things to do. With that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much for the attention, and I'll be happy to take on any questions if there's any. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mateos. And yes, there are some questions in the chat. We would love to go ahead and ask them.
Very glad to address them. Thank you.
Thank you. And Namu wants to know, we know relational data is stored in the memory as B plus trees. How are the graphs stored in the memory?
Yeah, very good question. Indeed, there is graphs are mathematical objects, of course, and then to work with them and learn with them, we have to be able to store them in a computer, right? So then there's various data structures that can be used. Clearly, a graph, the connectivity of a graph can be stored in a two-dimensional array, where in one dimension you have the nodes, in the other the nodes as well. So then you, in the entry Aij of that array, then you store with a 1 if nodes I and j are connected, and then 0 otherwise. So then you, a natural native structure to store a graph in a computer is a two-dimensional array. Now, that of course can be very inefficient because most graphs are highly sparse, which means that most nodes are not connected. In a network of billion nodes, maybe less than 0.1% of these are connected, like in social networks. So then storing a lot of zeros is highly inefficient. So then people instead use things like known as edge lists or adjacency lists, where you basically only store which pairs of nodes are connected. And then that's a list. There's various data structures. And for example, libraries like NetworkX and whatever have those natively implemented. They have data structures which are specifically crafted to store graphs efficiently. But in a way, you just need to store what's connected to what as a list or a two-dimensional array or what have you.
Okay, thank you. Raima asks, GNNs require a lot of computational power to work properly. Currently, are there any tools or ways to work with graphical models if we simply want to practice?
Yeah, indeed. Not all again, some GNNs, what typically drives computational challenges or cost is, again, if these graphs are huge or the like, but not all graphs are large, right? If you talk about a molecule, then these are small graphs with a few atoms, 4 or 5 or whatever, and edges. And then just trying it out using, for example, those libraries I had at the very end, Python geometric, PyTorch geometric, and the like, then you can do it in your own personal computer without any problem. As again, all things in machine learning, if you want to learn a very large language model, maybe only OpenAI can do it. Only a handful of companies can actually train those humongous models, but then you can just play if you want with a simple deep learning architecture or with a simple SVM or whatever. You can train and start getting insights at home yourself, right? Well, same thing with GNNs. There's interesting problems across the scale of complexities. One doesn't need to work with a Facebook level scale graph, let's say, to get insights of how these things works. You can actually work with those at smaller scale. And then there's many, for example, if you go to the websites of those classes I suggested, these courses, many of them have a simple Google Colabs where you can load network data and then run models on them, at which you can do in your computer over minutes. So then you can train models fairly simply to get to play with those and learn from those. Of course, then in production, if Amazon is running these things, then they are like another scale. But yeah, to learn, you can use small models, and that's perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how do researchers address the sparsity issues associated with graph data, particularly when dealing with incomplete or missing information?
I missed the word before. What were the issues?
Oh, I'll repeat the question.
Sure, thank you.
How do researchers address the sparsity issues associated
Sparsity.
with graph data when dealing
Yes.
with incomplete or missing information?
Good. Yeah, thank you. Exactly. As I said, most graphs are sparse, and indeed, sparsity is something we want to leverage. That alleviates a lot the complexity. And then many of these software libraries, in a way, first are smart, recognizing that graphs are sparse, and then they just store the connections, which are very few compared to the potential space of possible connections. Namely, we don't store the zeros or the non-edges, so we leverage that. Many of these operations, then when you run a graph neural network, you are computing representations of different nodes or edges, and then that requires some calculations involving the graph structure. And then these are highly optimized, taking into account that many of these graphs have particular structures, namely sparsity and the like. And then the hardware you can use as well can be in a way co-designed to the application. If you want to do fancier things to scale up and optimize efficiency, then one can take into account kind of the whole spectrum, right? From hardware to software, take into account the particular structures you have. But even many of the routines in these Python libraries for ML on graphs just leverage the fact that graphs are sparse, and then they take into account to minimize computations again. again, through numerical computations for many decades, people have exploiting sparsity in many domains to multiply matrices and beyond. The same thing can be done, of course, with careful software engineering to leverage sparsity in graph-based learning, indeed. Sparsity is key.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question is, what are the implications of graph technology being misused by malicious individuals?
Yeah, great question. That's again something as we are seeing AI technologies becoming more and more deployed, more and more accessible to anybody with generative AI, generation of fake images or videos or content and the like. Well, that's not extraneous to potential use, right, of graph neural network technologies, right, or learning with graphs. Again, it's just the general premise or the general safeguards we have to deploy then for general AI of, again, image data or videos or the like, then that same thing applies to learning with graphs. So, of course, trustworthiness, as I mentioned in the end, and looking at fairness, then are very important issues in research agendas and then of companies using these models. Fairness, in particular, I'm working on that myself with some collaborators. Using graphs in a way adds an additional problematic level because many of these GNN models require aggregation of information of nodes connected in a graph. And then many of these graphs, because you typically, these are constructed by connecting nodes which are similar. Well, if there are sensitive attributes of these nodes, for example, ethnical, racial, or socioeconomic, well, it's likely that the graph is going to connect nodes which have similar sensitive attributes. So then if you use the graph in a way, then to form aggregations in neural networks, then you are going to increase the correlation of predictive outputs with sensitive attributes. So then, and you want to try to avoid that correlation to minimize bias and to have more fairness predictions or decisions, right? So then one has to, there is a particular interesting problems that arises with working with graphs, then one has to be carefully addressing. And that's, of course, subject to a lot of interesting current work in that space. But I would say, in summary, we have to be very careful with how we deploy AI technologies. And the same thing is true, of course, when we're thinking of AI technologies that involve graph data.
Okay, thank you so much. And another question is, what are your thoughts on the applicability of graphs in natural language processing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have to admit, I'm by no means an expert in NLP, but clearly many graphs are there, right? Many models of language or of grammar are really using based on trees. They're captured through graphs, and indeed successful architectures, right, for NLP are transformers today, self-attention mechanisms and the like. And again, there's been connections indeed between transformers and then GNNs in a way where a transformer basically can be viewed as a GNN run on a fully connected graph. So typically, I was saying most graphs are sparse, but while some architectures rely a lot in basically in kind of multifaceted dependencies, and then that shows up in fully connected graphs that can be viewed as what's going on under the engine of a transformer. Of course, in a transformer, those connection edge weights, let's say, and all those connections are learnable. That those are the attention mechanisms, but indeed, a transformer is not too different from a GNN, as it turns out. Of course, a transformer, for example, yeah, is based on a fully connected graph. So then one could argue there's not too much you are using on the graph if everything connected to everything, but well, the weights which you learn then play a key role. So again, not a lot I know about NLP, but indeed graphs are very relevant therein. And people have been exploring connections between GNNs and transformers, and interesting things to look at there as well.
Thank you for answering that. And Nor wants to know, are there promising learning algorithms other than backprop for training GNNs?
Yeah, no, I think the nice thing is that we can get away with backprop, sort of how do we train GNNs? Basically using backpropagation. Again, GNNs and CNNs, convolutional networks for images, are not too different in a way. Again, I didn't have time to go over that of the how, as I mentioned, but the GNN, simplifying it a little bit, nicely enough, is you can view it just like as a CNN, but then the question is, how do we define the convolution module to form convolutions for graph data? And those aggregations, that module is kind of different, but then at the end of the day, a GNN is just a CNN with a specific convolution. It's just a composition of a convolutional graph convolutional modules with nonlinearities, blah, blah, blah. You have a loss function, and then to train parameters, you use backprop basically in a similar way than in a standard CNN. So then that's not too different. And I think that's good. We can reuse a lot of the know-how on how to train large deep learning models also for graphs. Of course, there are some caveats to this. We typically don't have such deep GNN models as in deep learning, for example, because there's other issues that arise. But yeah, we use backprop to train GNNs as well.
Okay, thank you. Which machine learning library is best for graph-based analytics, like PyTorch or TensorFlow?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm not advocating for anything here because I think that has kind of it's Meta versus Google. I don't take any side, but here as a general Python open source library for working with graphs, a lot of people use NetworkX. That became kind of a de facto library, but that doesn't give you the functionality for machine learning on graphs. Then I would say that for that additional layer, the most widely used, I believe, is PyTorch Geometric. So it's an extension of PyTorch. PyTorch is for standard deep learning pipelines. PyTorch Geometric is a compatible library now that kind of builds on the essence of PyTorch for deep learning, but now for deep learning on graphs. And PyTorch Geometric integrates or interfaces very nicely with NetworkX, which has a lot of functionality to load graphs, to work with graphs, and then adds the additional machine learning functionality for GNN-based learning. But I think many of them are good. In my experience, my students, we mostly work with PyTorch Geometric, but yeah, there's a lot of these things are being developed as we speak. So there's a lot of alternatives. All of them have their pros and cons, but I think like most people, I believe, use PyTorch Geometric.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you suggest a framework to incorporate XAI to measure fairness from GNN output, for example, in drug-drug interaction prediction?
Yeah, well, there is there's that's a good question in a way. There's a lot of literature, and I can give specific pointers afterwards. I don't remember on the top of my head, but there's a lot of work on looking at fairness on graphs, approaches to, for example, mitigate bias. Bias can arise in many forms and colors, if you want, in graph-based learning. As I mentioned, there's structural biases coming from the graph itself, and then through aggregations in GNNs that can be amplified. There's different forms of bias, and for that, there's different ways to mitigate those through maybe graph rewiring. You just slightly modify the graph to minimize that. There's data augmentation approaches. You slightly sample the data in a way to try to minimize bias, and you carefully craft the probability loss you use to sample data. Again, there's many ways to work with bias mitigation. I think maybe you were asking about metrics. There's different metrics depending on the type of biases that's been measured. There's group fairness, individual fairness, and for that there's measures like equal opportunity, that basically the lower the better, the more fair. Structural parity, also the lower the better. So then, yeah, I cannot give a very concrete answer. That kind of also requires me elaborating more. But then there's different notions of bias. There's many definitions, and then there's metrics that people have been crafting to then assess the quality or effectiveness of the methods they developed for bias mitigation.
Okay, thank you so much. Nor wants to know also, what's the difference between a GNN embedding and a text embedding obtained from BERT?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. Not a lot. Many of the neural network embeddings were maybe inspired by language embeddings or text embeddings, like, for example, word to back. And then you have, that's again, a classic embedding. Of course, now we use attention and transformers, but kind of a classic text embedding was word to back. And that, for example, led by analogy, right, that you can think of as a text, as a sequence of words. And then that sequence of words, you can view it as a sequence of nodes in a graph which are connected. Well, from word to back, people, for example, crafted using similar random walk procedures, what's known as node to back, to then obtain embeddings of nodes in graphs with similar ideas. So then there's lots of connections. But of course, then with graph neural networks, there's a lot of different fancier, the connection is very clear there. Then I don't know details about BERT. I know it's a very famous language model, but then GNNs do kind of aggregations of nodes to obtain node embeddings. And again, with the connection of GNNs and transformers, I would think that then also there's not too many difference, but of course they are. I just don't know the details, which I can also summarize here quickly.
Okay, thank you. Are you okay with your time?
I'm
If we
fine. Let's
go
go
ahead.
for it.
Yeah,
Happy to be here.
okay. Thank you. It seems a neural network model is also kind of a network. Can graph analysis techniques be used to improvise the hyperparameter tuning process while building a custom neural network?
Yeah, that's a great question. Indeed. Many times I teach a class on network science now this semester, and then students carry out projects, and then several times they have been interested in, again, recognizing that a neural network, right, is a collection of modules which are connected. One can view that as a graph as well, and so forth. Well, many times in a way, those are so structured that the network itself is not very interesting from a network analysis perspective. There's a lot of structure there. But indeed, as one looks at fancier architectures, the models are becoming more and more complex, then indeed, I haven't thought about this myself. I haven't conducted this study seriously or haven't seen this elsewhere, but it's clearly a good idea maybe to leverage insights or cross-pollinate insights from network analysis to then try to study properties of the neural network structures and maybe, yeah, find more efficient, insightful, or intelligent ways of picking up hyperparameters or others kind of to design the depth of your network or the connections or the like. All that is fair game and potentially something worth studying.
Thank you. And our last question is, are GNNs more promising than quantum neural networks and spiking neural networks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a question. I don't know the details about the quantum neural networks or spiking. I guess they are more, I would guess, biologically inspired based on how the brain operates and the like. I don't know the details of them, so I don't feel comfortable answering whether one's better than the other. Yeah, I just don't know. I apologize for that.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of everyone, we would love to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. We are grateful to have had the opportunity to learn from you and your contributions to the field.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And if anybody wants to follow up, I guess people have my coordinates, and then please feel free to send me an email anytime, and I'll be happy to follow up. My pleasure.
Thank you. And just before we leave, we would love to take a picture.
Yes.
So if everyone could turn on their cameras to take a screenshot.
Now that I see you, hi everyone, and thanks for attending. Thanks for your questions. Maybe it's late where you are, so thanks for staying.
I'm just gonna wait for the thumbs up. Someone's taking the picture. Okay, I think we got it. Thank you, Dr. Mateos, for being here with us. And if some people have extra questions, we'll make sure for them to send it to your email.
Thank you. Good seeing you all. Nice meeting you. And yeah, good luck. Hopefully this is useful and you can play with it eventually.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.